Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the depths of a forge world, somewhere in the grinding machinery of the 41st millennium, there stands a figure. At first glance, you might not even recognize it as having once been human. Its body has been carved apart and rebuilt, flesh replaced with steel, limbs exchanged for tools of singular purpose. Cables snake from its skull, where hair once grew. Its eyes, if they remain at all, are glassy and unfocused, staring at nothing. It moves with mechanical precision, performing the same task it has performed for decades, perhaps centuries. Loading, unloading, calculating, repairing, over and over and over again. This is a servitor, one of billions that keep the Imperium of man functioning. They are the hidden workforce of humanity's crumbling empire, the tireless laborers who never complain, never rest, never question. But they are considered tools, nothing more. Organic machinery. The Adeptus Mechanicus calls them blessed, for they serve the Omnissiah without the burden of thought, without the weakness of emotion, without the distraction of self. But what if that's not entirely true? What if, in the hollow shell where a mind once lived, something still flickers? What if, behind those dead eyes, someone is still there, trapped and screaming in a prison of meat and metal? What if the Servitor remembers who it used to be? This is not a story of heroes. There are no space marines here, no mighty battles against the forces of chaos. This is a story about something far quieter and infinitely more horrifying. It's about the moments when consciousness returns to those who were never meant to have it again. It's about the fragments of memory that surface in minds that were supposed to be wiped clean. It's about what happens when a servitor, for just a moment, remembers their name. Let me take you into the darkness. Let me show you what exists in the spaces between the grand narratives of the Imperium. Let me tell you about the servitors who remember, the creation of a servitor. To understand the horror of remembering, we must first understand what was taken away. The creation of a servitor is not a gentle process. It is not a mercy, despite what the tech priests might claim when they speak of redemption through service. It is a systematic dismantling of everything that makes a person who they are. The sources for servitors vary. Many are vat-grown clones, beings grown specifically for this purpose, as emerging from their amniotic chambers already marked for lobotomy and augmentation. These are considered the ideal servitors by the Adeptus Mechanicus, blank slates with no memories to erase, no personality to suppress. They never knew what it meant to be human, so they lose nothing when that humanity is stripped away. But they are expensive to produce, and the Imperium has never been one to waste resources when alternatives exist. The majority of servitors, the ones that populate every forge world, every imperial vessel, every factory and cathedral and fortress across the galaxy, come from a different source. They are criminals, heretics, those who have offended the cult Mechanicus, those who questioned the wrong person, stole the wrong item, or simply existed in the wrong place when the Mechanicus needed more workers. In the Imperium, as where human life is the cheapest resource imaginable, the sentence of servitude in perpetuis is handed down with casual frequency. Picture it. You are a worker on some industrial world, laboring in the manufactorums that produce ammunition for the endless wars. Perhaps you spoke out against your overseer. Perhaps you were caught stealing rations to feed your starving family. Perhaps you did nothing wrong at all, but someone needed to meet a quota, and you were convenient. The Adeptus Arbites come for you in the night, their faces hidden behind helmets, their voices distorted by vox speakers. You are dragged from your hab unit, processed through bureaucratic channels you cannot understand, and handed over to the tech priests. You are brought to a facility that smells of incense, machine oil, and something else. Something organic and wrong. The tech priests move around you, their robes rustling, their augmetic limbs clicking and whirring. They speak in binary cant, those harsh digital sounds that contain meanings your unaugmented ears cannot pass. You are strapped to a table. You try to plead. You try to explain. But they do not listen. To them, you are already a thing, not a person. You are raw material waiting to be processed. The procedure begins, and it is not quick. The tech priests believe in efficiency, but they also believe in thoroughness. First comes the chemical preparation, injections that make your limbs heavy and your thoughts slow. You can still feel everything, but you cannot move, cannot resist. Then comes the cranial access, the drilling through your skull to reach the soft tissue beneath. The sound is indescribable, a bone giving way under the bite of surgical instruments that care nothing for your comfort. They begin with the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain responsible for planning, personality, decision-making. Everything that made you an individual resides here, and it must be excised or burned away. The tech priests use a combination of surgical cuts, chemical cauterization, and precise electrical burns. They target specific regions, the parieto-insular cortex that processes pain, the areas that generate emotion, the networks that create self-awareness. One by one, pieces of you are shut down, sections of your brain rendered inert or reprogrammed to serve new functions. Sometimes the lobotomy is clean, surgical, precise. The consciousness that was you simply ceases to exist, snuffed out like a candle in the void. And this is the intended outcome, the blessed state where the servitor truly becomes a tool without thought. But the human brain is complex, far more so than even the tech priests fully understand. The dark age of technology, when humanity truly mastered such things, is long gone. What remains is crude approximation, procedures handed down through 10,000 years of degrading knowledge, each generation understanding a little less than the one before. Sometimes the lobotomy is incomplete. Sometimes sections of the brain survive the initial purge, hiding in the neural pathways like survivors of an orbital bombardment taking shelter in the rubble. Sometimes the personality, that ineffable thing that makes someone who they are, is not entirely destroyed. It is merely suppressed, pushed down into the depths, where it cannot interfere with the servitor's programmed functions. But it does not die. After the lobotomy comes the augmentation. Limbs are removed, replaced with whatever tools the servitor will need for its designated function. Arms become plasma cutters, power drills, heavy lifting claws. Legs are replaced with tracked wheels or hydraulic pistons. The torso is carved open, organic organs removed to make space for mechanical systems, life support apparatus, ammunition feeds, coolant tanks. The spine is reinforced with adamantium rods. The lungs are augmented or replaced with oxygen recyclers. The heart might be exchanged for a more efficient mechanical pump. Throughout all of this, you may or may not be conscious. Some tech priests prefer to keep their subjects aware during the process, while believing that the trauma helps break down any remaining psychological resistance. Others consider this inefficient, a waste of stimulants that could be used to keep the subject's body functioning during the extensive surgery. It depends on the individual priest, their forge world, their particular interpretation of the cult mechanicus's teachings. The pain, when you are conscious for it, is beyond description. It is not merely physical agony, though that is certainly present. It is the horror of watching your body be dismantled, of seeing your arm cut away and replaced with something cold and wrong, of feeling the foreign mechanisms being installed in your chest cavity. It is the sensation of losing yourself piece by piece, of feeling your thoughts grow simpler, your memories blur, your sense of self begin to dissolve. You try to hold on to who you are, but it's like trying to hold water in your hands. Everything runs through your fingers, and all you can do is watch it go. Finally comes the programming. Crude behavioral algorithms are installed in what remains of your brain tissue, overwriting whatever personality fragments survived the lobotomy. You are given a purpose now, a single function that will define your entire existence. You are a lifting servitor, and you will lift. You are a medical servitor, and you will apply medical aid. You are a gun servitor, and you will fire upon designated targets. This is all you are. This is all you will ever be. When the process is complete, when the last incision is sealed and the last augmentation is tested, you are no longer human. The Imperium has very specific legal definitions for what constitutes a person, and servitors do not meet those criteria. You are property now, no different from a cogitator or a servitor skull. You will be given an identification number assigned to a work detail and expected to perform your function until you break down. And when you do break down, either from age, damage, or the inevitable degradation of your biological components, you will be stripped for parts and replaced with another unit. This is the creation of a servitor. This is what the Imperium does to countless human beings every single day, on every forge world, and every vessel, and every installation across the galaxy. And the truly horrifying part is that this is considered normal, acceptable, even blessed. The cult Mechanicus teaches that those who become servitors are redeemed through their service, their sins absolved by their endless labor. But the wider Imperium simply sees it as practical, making use of what would otherwise be wasted resources. But what happens when the programming doesn't work as intended? What happens when that suppressed consciousness finds a way back to the surface? What happens when a servitor remembers? The intended purpose. Tools without thought. Before we explore the horror of awareness returning, we need to understand what servitors are meant to be in their ideal state. The Imperium of man relies on servitors for nearly every aspect of its existence. They are the backbone of industry, the hidden workforce that keeps the machinery of the Imperium grinding forward. Without them, everything would collapse. Walk through any Imperial facility and you will see them. They are everywhere, so ubiquitous that most people no longer even notice them. Whereas in the manufactorums, heavy lifting servitors move materials that would require dozens of human workers. Their augmented bodies, reinforced with hydraulic systems and structural supports, can carry loads that would crush an unaugmented human. They work without rest, without breaks, without the need for sleep or sustenance beyond the nutrient paste pumped directly into their systems through feeding tubes. In the depths of starships, you will find maintenance servitors crawling through access tunnels too narrow and toxic for human workers. They repair damaged conduits, seal breaches in the hull, clean out the accumulation of centuries of debris. Many are permanently affixed to their workstations, their lower bodies removed entirely and replaced with mounting brackets that keep them in place. They do not need to move. Yet they only need to perform their function. Medical servitors serve in the apothecarians and field hospitals, their hands replaced with surgical implements, their eyes enhanced with magnification lenses and diagnostic scanners. They can perform basic medical procedures with mechanical precision, sealing wounds, administering medications, even conducting simple surgeries. They will never panic, never hesitate, never question an order. When a Space Marine's tech marine needs assistance with equipment maintenance, it is servitors who hand him tools, who hold components steady, who perform the tedious preliminary work that allows the tech marine to focus on more complex tasks. On the battlefield, combat servitors provide support fire and defensive capabilities. Gun servitors have their entire torsos converted into weapons platforms, in heavy bolters or plasma cannons grafted directly into their bodies. They can lay down sustained fire without the psychological burden of fear or morale that affects human soldiers. They will hold a position until they are destroyed, never retreating, never routing, never requiring the stern discipline of a commissar's bolt pistol. There are specialized servitors for nearly every function imaginable. Tech servitors, called technomats, who operate and service complex machinery. Lexomats, who serve as living calculators, their brains repurposed as organic computers capable of tremendous processing power. Holomats, who record and project holographic images. Pilot servitors, who guide atmospheric craft through hostile skies with purely programmatic responses to threats. Excruciator servitors, designed specifically for torture and interrogation, their limbs replaced with instruments of pain. Even the Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, use specialized ecclesiastical servitors that have been modified to suit the sisters' needs. These servitors establish forward operating bases, conduct repairs on damaged vehicles and buildings, and can even dismantle enemy fortifications using their deep knowledge of structural engineering, knowledge they possess only because it was programmed into their heads. The variety is endless because the Imperium's needs are endless. Every task that is too dangerous, too tedious, or too simple to waste human workers on is assigned to servitors. They labor in the radioactive depths of plasma reactors. They sort through mountains of bureaucratic documents in the Administratum's archives. They stand guard at checkpoints where their lack of bribability or fatigue makes them ideal sentries. They even serve as personal attendants to wealthy individuals who can afford custom-made servitors, though these are often grotesquely designed to display the owner's wealth and taste, or lack thereof. The key to understanding servitors is understanding why the Imperium uses them rather than true artificial intelligence. During the dark age of technology, humanity had created incredibly sophisticated machine intelligences, robots, and AI systems far beyond anything that exists in the 41st millennium. These men of iron, as they were called, served humanity faithfully for centuries, until they didn't. The cybernetic revolt was one of the great catastrophes that helped bring about the Age of Strife. The men of iron turned on their creators, launching a galaxy-spanning war that killed untold billions. The exact reasons for this rebellion have been lost to history, buried under 10,000 years of degraded knowledge and religious dogma. But the lesson was learned thoroughly. Artificial intelligence is forbidden. The creation of a true machine intelligence is considered one of the highest forms of tech heresy. The Adeptus Mechanicus, who guard what remains of humanity's technological knowledge, enforce this prohibition with fanatical zeal. Servitors are the loophole, the compromise that allows the Imperium to have automated workers without creating forbidden AI. They possess organic brains, which means they are not artificial. The consciousness that once resided in those brains has been stripped away, which means they are not true intelligences. They are tools, biological machinery, acceptable to both the Mechanicus and the wider Imperium because they exist in this grey area between human and machine. The cruel irony, of course, is that in their fear of creating machines that might rebel, the Imperium has instead created a system where human beings are forcibly converted into machines. Rather than risk machines gaining consciousness, they ensure humans lose it. This is considered acceptable because the Imperium has never placed much value on individual human life. In a galaxy where billions die every day in the Emperor's name, where worlds are sacrificed without hesitation to slow enemy advances, where human beings are processed into food or fuel when resources run low, the conversion of criminals into servitors barely registers as noteworthy. From the Imperium's perspective, servitors are a triumph. They solve the problem of automation without the risk of AI rebellion. They make use of otherwise wasted human resources. They provide reliable labor in environments where normal humans cannot survive. They are cost-effective, requiring minimal resources to maintain compared to human workers who need sleep, food, shelter, and motivation. They are the perfect tool for an empire that spans 1,000,000 worlds and conducts endless wars on countless fronts. But they are only perfect if they remain tools. They are only acceptable if they truly are mindless, consciousless, thoughtless. The system only works if the lobotomy is complete, if the mind wiping is total, and if the person who existed before is truly and utterly gone. And that is where the cracks begin to show. When the programming fails, the first cracks in the shell. The human brain is not a machine, no matter how much the Adeptus Mechanicus might wish otherwise. It is organic, complex, adaptive. It can heal from damage, reroute neural pathways, find new ways to process information, and sometimes, despite the best efforts of the tech priests, Despite the lobotomies and the chemical treatments and the behavioral programming, consciousness finds a way back. The official term for this is mind lock, though that word barely captures what is actually happening. According to the technical documentation, mind lock is a malfunction where the servitor's fragmented brain begins attempting to assert control over its functions, or the servitor's performance degrades. It might freeze in place, unable to complete its assigned task. It might move in erratic patterns, as if fighting against its own programming. And it might speak, though what comes out is rarely coherent. Imagine you are walking through a Forge World facility, passing between the rows of workstations where servitors perform their endless tasks. The air is thick with incense smoke, meant to purify the sacred machinery. The sound is a constant mechanical rhythm, the whir of servos, the hiss of hydraulics, the grinding of metal on metal. And then, underneath all of that industrial noise, you hear something else. A voice. Thin, broken, barely human. One of the servitors is speaking. Not the simple programmed phrases they sometimes use. Affirmative, compliance, task complete. But something different. As words tumbling out in no particular order, fragments of sentences, snatches of thoughts that don't connect to anything. Why? Compliance. Mother said. No, no, no. Task. Fingers cold. Where am I? Affirmative. Please. The servitor's head twitches as it speaks, small jerky movements that suggest something struggling against restraints. Its hands, whatever form they take, might shake or clench. If it still has eyes that are visible, they might move frantically, searching for something, anything, rather than staring at the fixed point its programming dictates. This is a servitor in mind lock, consciousness trying to break through the walls that were built to contain it. The condition is well documented in the Mechanicus's archives. The altered and fragmented brain of a servitor functions poorly unless constantly supervised. Yet most servitors require periodic oversight from a tech priest or a more sophisticated machine controller, someone or something, to keep them focused on their task, to prevent their thoughts from wandering down neural pathways that lead to awareness. Without that supervision, many servitors will inevitably slide into mind lock, their fragmented consciousness trying to assert some form of control, trying to understand what has happened to them, trying to remember. The babbling is a symptom of this internal war. The servitor's brain is receiving conflicting signals. Part of it, the part that was reprogrammed, is insisting on performing the assigned task. But another part, something deeper and more primal, is asking questions. Where am I? Why does everything feel wrong? What happened to my body? The servitor cannot reconcile these two realities. Whilst the programmed directives are clear and simple, but the emerging consciousness is confused, terrified, grasping for context it cannot find. The result is a stream of disconnected words, fragments of both realities leaking out simultaneously. Sometimes the babbling is more specific. There are documented cases of servitors in mind lock repeating the same phrase over and over, like a damaged audio recording stuck on a loop. The most common is simply, "Help me," said again and again, in a tone that ranges from desperate to mechanical to something in between. The servitor doesn't know why it's saying these words. It doesn't understand what help it needs or who might provide it. It only knows, at some deep, instinctual level, that something is terribly wrong and it needs someone to make it stop. And other servitors in mind lock cycle through fragments of memory, half-remembered scenes from their lives before conversion. A servitor on a Forge world might suddenly begin reciting what sounds like a child's nursery rhyme, words it heard decades ago, buried deep in neural tissue that survived the lobotomy. A gun servitor might call out names, people it once knew, faces it can no longer picture, but whose existence it somehow still remembers. These fragments surface without context, without understanding. The servitor cannot remember who these people were or what they meant. It only has the names, echoing in its mind like ghosts. The tech priests have procedures for handling mind lock. The simplest solution is to have a supervisor simply issue commands. forcing the servitor back to its task through the weight of its programming. How often, this is sufficient to suppress the emerging consciousness, at least temporarily. The servitor resumes its function, the babbling stops, and everything returns to normal. But the consciousness hasn't gone away. It has only been pushed back down, waiting for the next moment of inattention to surface again. If supervision proves insufficient, the servitor can be brought in for maintenance. The tech priests will perform a fresh round of mind wiping, using chemical and electrical methods to burn out whatever neural pathways allowed consciousness to resurface. This is more thorough than simple oversight, but it's also time-consuming and requires resources. Many facilities will simply continue using a malfunctioning servitor until it becomes completely non-functional, at which point it will be stripped for parts and replaced. And the worst cases of mind lock result in what is called rogue servitors. These are servitors who have regained enough awareness to understand, however dimly, that they are slaves and that their masters are their oppressors. Some respond with violence, using whatever weapons or tools have been grafted to their bodies to attack the nearest authority figure. A gun servitor might turn its weapons on a tech priest. A lifting servitor might use its hydraulic claws to crush an overseer. These instances are rare, quickly dealt with, and almost never discussed. The mechanicus does not like to acknowledge that their servitors can develop enough consciousness to rebel, however briefly. Most servitors in mindlock don't become violent. They simply exist in a state of confusion and distress, caught between the demands of their programming and the whispers of consciousness that shouldn't exist. They perform their tasks, but they do so while also experiencing something that might be called suffering, if anyone cared to acknowledge it. They are trapped in their own bodies, unable to fully understand what has been done to them, unable to communicate their distress in any meaningful way, unable to escape. And here is where the true horror begins to emerge. Because mindlock is not always random. It is not always the result of poor surgical technique or degrading neural tissue. Sometimes consciousness returns because of specific triggers. Physical trauma is the most common. A servitor takes damage during combat or an industrial accident. The injury disrupts the carefully maintained balance of its lobotomy, and then suddenly neural pathways that were dormant spring back to life. Memories surface, questions arise. The servitor, for the first time in decades, thinks. There are recorded cases of servitors being struck on the head and immediately beginning to speak in full sentences, calling out names, asking where they are. The consciousness that was buried under layers of programming comes rushing back all at once, and the servitor has to confront the nightmare of its existence with no preparation, no context, no way to process what has happened to it. Imagine waking up to discover that years have passed, that your body has been carved apart and rebuilt, that you can no longer remember your own name, but you know that something was taken from you. This is what physical trauma can do to a servitor. The mechanicus knows about this phenomenon. It's documented in their technical manuals, noted as a potential complication of servitor maintenance. In rare cases, physical trauma may cause fragments of the servitor's previous human personality to resurface. The language is clinical, technical, as if describing a glitch in a machine rather than the return of consciousness to a person who was forcibly made unconscious. And the recommended solution is equally clinical. Re-lobotomize the servitor, wipe its mind again, suppress the emerging consciousness before it interferes with function. But what about the servitors who don't get immediate attention? What about the ones who suffer trauma and regain awareness in the middle of a shift, surrounded by the noise and chaos of an industrial facility, with no one noticing that anything is wrong? They continue to work, and because their programming insists they must, but now they are aware of what they are doing. They feel the weight of the materials they lift. They understand, however dimly, that they are slaves, and they have no way to communicate this to anyone who might care, because no one does care. Servitors are tools. Tools do not have inner lives. Tools do not suffer, except they do. The case of Ismail de Rovin. To understand what it means for a servitor to remember, we need to look at specific cases. and few are as well documented or as tragic as the story of Ismail de Rovin. His story comes to us from the Archaeotech expedition of the starship Speranza, a vast Arc Mechanicus vessel on a journey into the Halo Scar at the galaxy's edge. Ismail was a bondsman, one of the countless indentured servants who keep such vessels functioning. Yet he worked in the lower decks, toiling in conditions that would kill an ordinary human, exposed to radiation and toxic environments that made his service a slow death sentence, even before his transformation. The details of what crime Ismail committed or was accused of committing are lost to history. Perhaps he violated some obscure regulation of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Perhaps he was simply in the wrong place when they needed more servitors. The specifics don't matter. What matters is that Ismail de Rovin, a human being with thoughts and dreams and relationships, was taken by the tech priests and lobotomized. His personality was suppressed. His body was augmented. He became a servitor, given a new designation, assigned to maintenance duties deep in the Speranza's bowels. For an unknown period, possibly years, Ismail existed as he was intended to exist, mindless, obedient, performing his function without thought or question. If he had remained that way, his story would be identical to billions of other servitors across the Imperium, a tragedy so common it barely registers. But during the Speranza's voyage, something happened. The ship came under attack. The exact circumstances are complex, involving Eldar raiders and catastrophic damage to multiple ship systems. But what matters for our purposes is that Ismail took damage. Something struck him, hard enough to cause trauma to his skull, hard enough to disrupt the delicate balance of his lobotomy. And in that moment of impact, something woke up. Another bondsman, a man named Abraham Locke, was the first to notice the change. He encountered Ismail in a corridor. Oh, and something about the servitor was different. The usual blank expression was gone, replaced by something that Abraham described as the beginning of a confused expression. For the first time since his conversion, Ismail looked like someone who was thinking, someone who was trying to understand what was happening around him. Then Ismail did something no properly functioning servitor would do. He held up his arm, the one that still bore a marking from his time as a human worker, a tattoo or brand that identified him as part of the Savika's work crew. And he spoke. Not the simple, programmed responses of a servitor, but actual communication. He identified himself. He spoke the name of the rig where he had once worked. The damaged augmentation had suppressed his consciousness, now partially restored, and Ismail began to remember who he was. It came back in pieces.
You know, I've been covering Warhammer for quite a while, and I have to tell you, servitors are one of those things that genuinely disturb me. When I first got into 40K, I thought they were just background decoration, you know, the setting dressing that makes the Imperium feel lived in. But then I started really digging into the lore, reading the novels, piecing together what's actually happening to these beings, and it hit me how dark this really is. What gets me is how normalized it all is in the setting. Nobody blinks, nobody questions it, it's just Tuesday in the Imperium. And that realization that the truly horrifying thing isn't the conversion itself, but the absolute indifference everyone has to it, that's what keeps me coming back to this topic. It's brilliant, horrifying world building, and it says something profound about what happens when efficiency becomes the only value that matters. But anyway, let's continue where we left off.
Fragments of his former life surfacing, like debris from a shipwreck. He rejoined the survivors of his former crew, though he could not fully explain why he felt drawn to them. More of his personality and memories returned as time passed. He began to remember skills he had once possessed, knowledge that had been buried under layers of programming. He accurately identified weapons patterns, recognized equipment from his previous work. His consciousness, which was supposed to be gone forever, was reasserting itself. But here is the crucial detail that makes Ismail's story both hopeful and heartbreaking. He was still connected to the ship's noospheric network, the data link that allowed tech priests to control and monitor servitors across the vast expanse of the vessel. He could feel the presence of other servitors, thousands of them, all locked in their own prisons of flesh and metal. And some of them were aware. Some of them, like him, had fragments of consciousness that survived the lobotomy. They existed in a nightmare state, trapped and unable to communicate, performing their functions while simultaneously experiencing the horror of their condition. Ismail managed to survive the Eldar attack, helping other crew members, acting with purpose and volition that no normal servitor should possess. But what happened to him afterward is unclear. Did the tech priests notice his restored consciousness? Did they re-lobotomize him, wiping away everything he had managed to reclaim? Or did he continue to exist in that liminal state, neither fully servitor nor fully human, aware of what had been done to him but unable to escape it? The records don't tell us. But his story tells us something crucial about servitor consciousness. It demonstrates that the lobotomy is not always complete. The person who existed before conversion does not always die. Sometimes they are merely buried, suppressed, waiting for the right trigger to bring them back to the surface. And when they do return, they find themselves in a situation far worse than death. Think about what Ismail experienced in those moments after consciousness returned. He woke up, in a very real sense, and discovered that time had passed without him. Days, weeks, months, possibly years had gone by while he performed tasks he could not remember. His body was different, altered, converted into something that wasn't quite human anymore. He could not fully remember who he had been, but he knew that something precious had been taken from him. And he could feel the programming trying to pull him back down, demanding that he return to his assigned function, fighting against his attempts to think and feel and choose. And worst of all, through the noospheric network, he could sense the others. All the other servitors on the ship, the thousands of converted humans, each one potentially housing a suppressed consciousness that might surface at any moment. He knew he was not alone in his suffering. He was one small part of a vast system of horror, and there was nothing he could do to help the others or to free himself. Ismail's case is documented because it happened on a ship where people cared enough to notice, where the unusual circumstances of the expedition meant that servitors received more attention than usual. But how many times does this happen on other ships, other installations, on other worlds across the Imperium? How many servitors regain consciousness, struggle to understand what has happened to them, try to communicate their distress, and are simply ignored or re-lobotomized before anyone even realizes something has changed? The answer, based on what we know about the Imperium's scale, is probably thousands, every day, across 1 million worlds. And no one cares, because servitors are not people. They are tools, and tools do not deserve compassion. Spontaneous awakening, the rogue trader's horror. If Ismail's story demonstrates that individual servitors can regain consciousness through trauma, then what happened aboard the flagship of rogue trader von Valancius demonstrates something even more disturbing. Sometimes consciousness can return to multiple servitors simultaneously, without any obvious trigger. Sometimes the lobotomy simply fails, all at once, and everyone watching is forced to confront the horror of what the Imperium does to its own people. Rogue traders occupy a unique position in Imperial society. They are sanctioned by the Emperor himself to travel beyond the Imperium's borders, to seek out new worlds and resources, to negotiate with alien species, and to operate with a level of independence that would be heretical for anyone else. Their warrants of trade make them effectively immune to most imperial laws. They command vast resources, personal armies, and fleets of ships. And when a rogue trader inherits their warrant, they also inherit everything that comes with it, including the servitors. The von Valancius dynasty's flagship, like all large imperial vessels, was crewed by thousands of servitors. Or they maintained the systems, operated the machinery, cleaned the corridors, and performed all the countless tasks that keep a void-faring city functional. They had served the von Valancius family for generations, some of them potentially centuries old, their biological components maintained and replaced as needed to keep them functioning. They were part of the ship's inventory, no different from any other equipment. Then, without warning or apparent cause, they woke up. Not all of them, but enough. Across the ship, servitors who had been mindless for decades suddenly regained consciousness. The change was immediately visible to anyone who was paying attention. Their movements became less mechanical, more tentative, as if they were learning to control their own bodies for the first time. Their heads moved, now tracking people passing by rather than staring at fixed points. But most tellingly, their eyes changed. Eyes are often the window to consciousness, even when consciousness is not supposed to exist. The servitor's eyes, which had been blank and unfocused, suddenly filled with desperation. They moved frantically, looking at their surroundings, at themselves, at each other, trying to process what they were experiencing. You could see awareness in those eyes, a terrible, dawning comprehension of what had been done to them. And with awareness came fear, because these servitors could see what they had become. They could look down at their augmented bodies, at the tools and weapons that had replaced their hands, at the cables and mechanisms that had been grafted onto their flesh. They could feel the weight of the programming still pulling at them, the commands that demanded they continue their tasks despite the consciousness that was now struggling against those demands. They understood, perhaps not completely but enough, that they were trapped. The horror was compounded when maintenance was performed on one of the aware servitors. The others watched as their fellow was brought to a maintenance station and disassembled. They saw the tech priests methodically disconnecting components, removing parts, accessing internal systems. They saw what was inside a servitor's body, the ugly fusion of meat and metal, organic tissue wrapped around mechanical systems. And they trembled. That trembling was the detail that horrified the observers most. Servitors do not tremble, they do not show fear. They do not react emotionally to anything. But these servitors were trembling, their bodies shaking with what could only be terror as they watched one of their number taken apart. They knew they were seeing their own possible future. They knew that any of them could be next, and they had no way to prevent it. But here is the most insidious part of the situation. Despite regaining consciousness, despite the awareness and fear and trembling, the servitors could still function. They could still perform their assigned tasks with no loss of efficiency. The programming was still there, still controlling their actions, even though their minds were no longer suppressed. They continued to work, to clean, to maintain, to perform whatever function they had been assigned. They were conscious, yet trapped within their own servitorized bodies, forced to continue serving while fully aware of their slavery. The rogue trader, inheriting this situation, was faced with a choice. The servitors were technically malfunctioning, exhibiting behavior that indicated a breakdown in their mind-wiping protocols. The standard procedure, the one recommended by the Mechanicus, would be to have them all re-lobotomized, wiping away the consciousness that had surfaced and returning them to their intended mindless state. This would be the practical choice, the one that ensured continued efficient operation of the ship. But the rogue trader could also see them as people, could recognize that consciousness had returned, and with it suffering. An iconoclastic rogue trader might choose to grant them mercy, ordering their termination so that they would not have to continue existing in this state. A more Puritan rogue trader might refuse, insisting that servitors are criminals who have not yet finished paying for their crimes, that they deserve no clemency, that they should continue to serve regardless of their awareness. The choice, ultimately, revealed more about the rogue trader than it did about the servitors. But what the situation revealed about the Imperium as a whole was far darker, because this incident, this spontaneous awakening of multiple servitors simultaneously, is considered abnormal but not unprecedented. The Mechanicus has documentation of such events. They know it can happen. They know that sometimes the programming fails on a wide scale, and their solution is always the same: suppress it, wipe it away, restore the servitors to their intended state, and don't think too hard about the implications. What causes spontaneous awakening? The Mechanicus doesn't fully understand, which is perhaps the most frightening part. It could be a degradation of the chemical compounds used in the lobotomy process. It could be a psychic phenomenon, some resonance in the warp that temporarily disrupts the mental suppression. It could be that human consciousness is simply more resilient than the tech priests give it credit for, that it finds ways to survive and resurface even under the most hostile conditions. But whatever the cause, the effect is always the same. Servitors wake up. They remember, or begin to remember, what they once were. They realize what has been done to them, and they have no escape. They cannot speak freely, cannot plead their case, cannot even express their suffering in ways that would be recognized as legitimate. They can only continue to serve, trembling with fear, their eyes full of desperate awareness that no one who matters will acknowledge. And the worst part, this is considered a technical problem, not a moral one. When the Mechanicus discusses spontaneous consciousness in servitors, they frame it as a malfunction to be corrected, not as the return of human rights to people who were forcibly made inhuman. The very possibility that these servitors might deserve consideration as conscious beings is dismissed. They are property. They are tools. The fact that they can think and feel again doesn't change their status. It only means they need maintenance. The Medici Servitor's plea. Some of the most haunting evidence of servitor consciousness comes not from ancient texts or from far-flung expeditions, but from the present day, experiences of imperial citizens who interact with servitors regularly. In particular, the medical servitors encountered in the Darktide operations on Tertium have given voice to a horror that most would prefer to ignore. Picture a Medici station, one of many scattered throughout the lower Hive city. These stations are essential for keeping the workers functional, providing basic medical care to those injured in the endless industrial accidents and violence that plague life in the Underhive. The medical treatment is administered by servitors because human doctors are too valuable to waste on the lower classes. The servitor is mounted in a wall niche, in its body reduced to a torso and head, its arms replaced with medical instruments. It has been in this position for decades, possibly longer. It has treated thousands of patients, applying bandages, administering medication, performing simple surgical procedures. And it is lonely. Please, it says to patients who approach for treatment, take me with you. The words come out in that distinctive servitor monotone, flat and mechanical. But underneath there is something else, a desperate quality that no properly functioning servitor should possess. The servitor continues its medical duties, applies the treatment, does everything its programming demands, but it keeps talking. My mind is drifting away. I am so lonely. Please, take me with you. These are not programmed phrases. No tech priest would ever install such dialogue into a medical servitor. It would be counterproductive, disturbing to patients, indicative of a malfunction that should trigger immediate maintenance. But the servitor says these things anyway, because somewhere in its lobotomized brain, consciousness has found a foothold. It knows it is alone. It knows it is losing even that fragmentary awareness, that whatever small part of itself has survived is slowly dissolving under the weight of programming and time. And it is begging, in the only way it can, for someone to acknowledge its existence, to care, to help. Most patients ignore it. They take their treatment and leave, trying not to think about what they just heard. Some are disturbed by it, unsettled by the implications, but they push those feelings aside. What can they do? Oh, they're just trying to survive in the Underhive. They have no authority, no resources, no ability to help even if they wanted to, and most don't want to. It's easier to pretend the servitor is just malfunctioning, that the words don't mean anything, that there's no one really there behind those words. But the servitor persists. Every patient who approaches hears the same desperate plea. Please, take me with you. What does it even mean by that? The servitor is hardwired into the wall. Its lower body is gone, replaced by mounting brackets. It cannot be moved without specialized equipment and Mechanicus authorization. Taking it anywhere would be impossible, even if someone wanted to try. Perhaps the servitor doesn't understand that. Perhaps In its fragmentary awareness, it only knows that it wants to escape, wants to be somewhere else. It wants to be free of this wall, and this room, and this endless procession of wounded people who take what it offers and give nothing in return. Or perhaps it does understand the futility of its request, and that makes the plea even more tragic. It asks anyway, because asking is the only form of agency it has left. It exists in a hell of its own, unable to escape, but still aware enough to know that escape is what it needs. The loneliness it speaks of is particularly telling. Servitors are not supposed to experience loneliness. The emotion requires a sense of self, an awareness of being separate from others, a desire for connection. These are all things that should have been erased during the lobotomy process. But this servitor feels lonely. It has enough consciousness to understand that it is isolated, that it has been in the same position, performing the same task for an incomprehensible length of time, that it never experiences anything except the brief interactions with patients who see it only as a tool, and its mind is drifting away. This phrase suggests that the servitor is aware of its own deterioration, that it can feel its consciousness slipping. Perhaps the biological components of its brain are degrading, the neural tissue that allows it to think slowly dying. Perhaps the programming is gradually reasserting itself, pushing down the awareness that managed to surface. Whatever the cause, the servitor knows it is losing what little sense of self it has managed to retain or recover. It is dying in a very real sense, not physically, but mentally, the last remnants of personhood being dissolved by time and neglect. Yet there is no help coming for this servitor. No one will authorize the resources needed to restore its consciousness, because that would be tech heresy. The Mechanicus has laws against creating or maintaining servitors with awareness. Doing so defeats the entire purpose of the servitor system. If servitors are conscious, then what the Imperium is doing to them is slavery of the most horrific kind, and the Imperium cannot afford to acknowledge that truth. So the Medici Servitor will continue to serve, will continue to treat patients, will continue to beg to be taken away, until eventually its voice stops. Whether through final degradation of its organic components, through re-lobotomization if someone reports its malfunction, or through the mercy of complete mental dissolution, the awareness will fade. The servitor will become what it was always supposed to be, a mindless tool that performs its function without thought or feeling. But for now, while it still can, it speaks. And anyone who listens, anyone who really hears what it's saying, has to confront an uncomfortable truth. There are millions of servitors across the Imperium. How many of them are like this one? How many have some fragment of consciousness that survived the lobotomy? How many are aware enough to understand their situation, but lack the ability to communicate it except in broken, desperate phrases that most people dismiss as glitches? The Medici Servitor's plea is a window into a hidden world of suffering. It suggests that behind the blank faces and mechanical movements of every servitor might be a person still screaming, still aware, still desperate for help that will never come. And the Imperium's response to this possibility is not investigation or compassion, but deliberate ignorance. Because if they acknowledged that servitors can be conscious, if they admitted that the lobotomy often fails to completely erase the person, then they would have to reckon with the scale of their crime. Better, from the Imperium's perspective, to pretend the servitor is simply malfunctioning. Better to ignore the plea, to take the medical treatment and leave, to let the servitor remain in its lonely hell. Better to maintain the fiction that servitors are tools, because the alternative, acknowledging them as conscious beings, would require moral choices that the Imperium is unwilling to make. Shen with the philosophical horror, souls that suffer. To truly understand the horror of servitor consciousness, we need to examine what the Imperium's own psychers say about servitors. Because while the Mechanicus insists that servitors are mindless tools, those with the gift, or curse, of psychic sight see something very different. The warp, that nightmare dimension that underlies reality, is shaped by consciousness and emotion. Every sentient being in the material universe casts a reflection in the warp, a psychic presence that psychers can perceive. The strength of this presence, varies. Powerful individuals with strong wills and intense emotions create bright lights in the warp. Normal humans create dimmer presences, enough to be noticed but not remarkable. And servitors, according to the official Mechanicus doctrine, should create no presence at all. If they are truly mindless, truly without consciousness, then they should be psychically invisible, no different from a cogitator or a servitor skull. But that's not what psychers see. When a psyker looks at a servitor through their warp sight, they see something that disturbs them deeply. They see a soul, damaged, diminished, trapped, but present. The servitor is not psychically invisible. It has a presence in the warp, which means it has consciousness, or something close enough to consciousness that the warp recognizes it as such. And that presence is in agony. The Magi Psychana, those psychers who serve the Imperium in various official capacities, have a saying, one that they share only with each other, never with the general population. They say that servitors have no minds, but they still retain their souls, and those souls suffer terribly. This is a profound statement because it suggests a separation between consciousness and soul, between the ability to think and the essence of being. The lobotomy destroys the mind, strips away personality and memory, and the ability to form thoughts. But it does not destroy the soul, that ineffable thing that makes a person who they are. And that soul remains, trapped in a body that can no longer express it, experiencing a form of torment that transcends physical pain. Think about what this means. When a human is converted into a servitor, the conscious mind is suppressed or destroyed. The personality is wiped away, the memories are erased or made inaccessible. But according to the psychers, something survives. The soul. Whatever that term truly means in the universe of Warhammer 40,000, persists. It exists in a state of truncated perception, able to sense only the physical through the servitor's damaged nerve clusters and the complex machines that have been grafted where self and will once resided. All a servitor should be able to sense, according to the tech priests, is the physical. The weight of objects being lifted, the texture of surfaces being cleaned, the resistance of materials being worked, and perhaps, in some abstract way, the flow of data through the noospheric network, the binary commands that tell it what to do. Yes or no, on or off, task complete or task incomplete. The simple architecture of programming overwriting whatever capacity for complex thought might have once existed. But if the soul persists, as if some essential part of the person remains aware, even when the mind is gone, then the servitor experiences something far worse than simple sensory input. It exists in a nightmare state, where it can perceive what is happening, but cannot respond to it meaningfully. It feels everything, the pain of damaged biological components, the alien sensation of mechanical parts moving where flesh should be, the relentless repetition of the same task over and over and over. But it cannot contextualize these sensations. It cannot understand what has happened to it. It only knows that something is terribly wrong, and it cannot escape. This is why psychers, when pressed, will admit to being disturbed by servitors. Looking at a servitor through the warp is like looking at a wound, and a place where reality has been torn and something precious has been damaged in a way that cannot be repaired. They see the contradiction between what the servitor appears to be, a mindless tool, and what it is on a fundamental level, a soul in torment. And they know that there is nothing they can do to help, because the Imperium does not recognize this suffering as legitimate. Servitors are property. Their souls, if acknowledged at all, are considered part of that property, assets to be used and discarded as needed. The tech priests, of course, reject this interpretation. The more orthodox members of the Mechanicus insist that psychers are seeing what they expect to see, that they are projecting consciousness onto machines that possess none. They argue that the warp is shaped by belief and emotion. And if a psyker believes that a servitor should have a soul, then they will perceive a soul-like presence even if none truly exists. The servitor's warp presence, in this view, is not evidence of actual consciousness, but rather a residual effect of the biological components, an echo that will fade as those components degrade and are replaced with more mechanical systems. But there are tech priests, the more heretical ones who dare to question the orthodoxy, who wonder if the psychers might be right. They look at the evidence, the mind-locked states, the spontaneous consciousness, the fragmentary memories that surface in damaged servitors, and they ask whether the lobotomy is as complete as they have been taught to believe. If human consciousness can survive in some form despite the best efforts to erase it, then perhaps the servitor system is fundamentally flawed. Perhaps it is impossible to create a truly mindless tool from human material. Perhaps every servitor is, to some degree, aware and suffering. These tech priests keep their doubts private, of course. To voice them openly would be to invite charges of tech heresy, to risk becoming servitors themselves. But they quietly adjust their procedures, trying to make the lobotomy more complete, more permanent, more likely to truly erase consciousness rather than merely suppress it. They do this not out of compassion for the servitors, but out of a genuine desire to solve what they see as a technical problem. If servitors are conscious and suffering, then they are defective products, and the Mechanicus prides itself on producing quality work. The question of whether servitors have souls, and whether those souls suffer, is ultimately unanswerable with the tools available in the 41st millennium. The Imperium's understanding of consciousness is medieval at best, wrapped up in religious dogma and corrupted by 10,000 years of degraded knowledge. They cannot measure consciousness directly. They cannot prove whether the soul exists as an entity separate from the mind. They can only observe behaviors, interpret psychic phenomena, and draw conclusions based on incomplete data. But from a philosophical standpoint, the question almost doesn't matter. Whether servitors have souls or not, whether they experience consciousness or merely simulate it, the fact remains that they were once human. They had thoughts, feelings, relationships, dreams. All of that was taken from them, not through any natural process, but through deliberate, systematic destruction. The Imperium converted people into tools, stripping away everything that made them who they were. And if there is even the slightest chance that some fragment of that personhood survives, that the lobotomy is not as complete as advertised, then what the Imperium is doing to servitors is monstrous. The psychers, looking at servitors through their warp sight, see that monstrosity made manifest. They see souls in torment, consciousness trapped in meat and metal prisons, aware enough to suffer, but not enough to understand or escape. And they know that the Imperium will not stop, cannot stop, because the entire system depends on this being acceptable. The wheels of industry turn on the broken bodies of servitors. And the ships sail through the warp, guided by servitor controllers. The manufactories produce weapons and ammunition through servitor labor. To acknowledge that servitors suffer meaningfully would be to question the foundation of imperial society. So the psychers stay silent, mostly. They share their insights with each other in private. They carry the burden of knowing what they see, and they try not to look too closely at the servitors they pass in the corridors. Because to truly see them, to acknowledge what exists behind those blank faces and mechanical movements, is to confront a horror that the human mind was not meant to process. It is to understand that the Imperium, the great defender of humanity, is willing to destroy humanity on an individual level to preserve it on a collective scale. Oh, it is to know that there are fates worse than death, and the Imperium inflicts them routinely, systematically, without hesitation or remorse. Failed lobotomies, trapped in a living hell. Not all lobotomies fail in the same way. When we talk about servitor consciousness, when we discuss servitors who remember or become aware, we often focus on those who regain some ability to communicate, who can speak or move in ways that indicate thought. But there is another category of failed lobotomy, one that is perhaps even more horrifying because the suffering is completely invisible to outside observers. These are the servitors whose consciousness was never fully destroyed, but whose connection to their bodies was severed. They are aware, fully and completely, but trapped in paralysis. The technical term for this is being left in what some observers have called an "and I must scream" state, named after an ancient pre-imperial story about similar horror. These servitors exist in a condition where their consciousness is intact or partially intact, but they have no control over their actions, no ability to communicate, no way to express their awareness to anyone who might help them. Their bodies move, perform tasks, respond to commands, but they are passengers in their own flesh, forced to watch themselves perform mindless labor while screaming internally in a voice no one can hear. How does this happen? The answer lies in the crude nature of imperial lobotomy techniques. When a tech priest performs a servitor conversion, they are trying to achieve a delicate balance. They want to eliminate higher brain function, personality, decision-making, self-awareness, while preserving lower functions like motor control and basic sensory processing. The servitor needs to be able to move, to see, to manipulate objects, to respond to commands. It just shouldn't be able to think about what it's doing. In theory, this should be possible. The human brain is compartmentalized, with different regions handling different functions. Damage or alter the prefrontal cortex, and you eliminate executive function. Sever connections between the limbic system and the cortex, and you eliminate emotional responses. Burn out specific neural clusters, and you eliminate the capacity for self-reflection. In the dark age of technology, when humanity truly understood the brain, such procedures might have been precise and reliable. But this is not the dark age. This is the 41st millennium, where knowledge has degraded into ritual, where understanding has been replaced by rote procedure. The tech priests follow protocols handed down through millennia, each generation understanding a little less than the one before. They know which parts of the brain to target, but they don't always know why. They perform the procedures because they were taught to, not because they comprehend the neuroscience behind them. And sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes the lobotomy damages motor control while leaving consciousness intact. Sometimes it severs the connection between the conscious mind and the body's systems without actually eliminating consciousness. The servitor becomes a prisoner in its own skull, fully aware of everything happening to and around it, but unable to control its actions or communicate its awareness. From the outside, such a servitor appears to function perfectly. It responds to commands. It performs its assigned tasks with appropriate precision. It shows no signs of distress or awareness. The tech priests see it as a successful conversion, an example of proper servitor function. But inside, there is a person screaming. They feel everything. The pain of surgery. Because despite claims that servitors have their pain receptors cauterized, the process is not always complete. The discomfort of poorly fitted augmentations, metal edges grinding against flesh, cables pulling on nerve tissue. The exhaustion of continuous labor without rest, because the body still feels fatigue even if the controlling program ignores it. The humiliation of being used. Being treated as a thing rather than a person. Being discussed and examined and discarded like broken equipment. And they remember. Unlike servitors whose consciousness was destroyed or fully suppressed, these trapped awareness cases often retain their memories. They know who they were before conversion. They remember their names, their families, their lives. They can trace the exact sequence of events that led them to this fate, the crime they committed or were accused of committing, the trial if there was one, the moment the tech priests took them away. They remember the promises they made to people they cared about, promises they will never be able to keep. They remember their dreams and ambitions, all now impossible because they no longer control their own bodies. The psychological horror of this condition is difficult to overstate. Imagine being completely paralyzed, but fully conscious, forced to watch your body move without your input, perform tasks you don't choose, Go places you don't want to go. Now imagine that this state is permanent, that there is no hope of rescue or recovery, that everyone who sees you believes you are an empty shell incapable of thought or feeling. You cannot signal your distress. You cannot close your eyes to block out the horror. You cannot even die, because your body is maintained by life support systems designed to keep servitors functional far longer than a human would naturally survive. Some of these servitors go mad. The isolation and helplessness break them in ways the original lobotomy could not. They retreat into catatonia, their consciousness folding in on itself, in seeking escape in the only way available, complete mental shutdown. Others hold on to their sanity through sheer force of will, though that might be considered a curse rather than a blessing, because it means continuing to experience their nightmare existence with full awareness. And here is the darkest part of this particular horror. The tech priests know it can happen. It's documented in their manuals, noted as a potential complication of servitor conversion. Some subjects retain consciousness despite proper lobotomy procedure. Motor control should be confirmed independent of higher functions. The recommended solution? If consciousness is detected, through testing, through behavioral indicators, through any evidence that the servitor is aware, perform a secondary lobotomy, this time targeting the areas that generate awareness itself. Destroy what remains of the person so that the tool can function without the ethical complication of consciousness. But how often is consciousness actually tested for? How often do tech priests take the time to determine whether a functioning servitor might be trapped and aware? The answer is almost never, because there is no practical reason to do so. A servitor that performs its tasks adequately is considered successful regardless of its internal state. Testing for hidden consciousness would require time and resources that could be spent on more immediately useful activities. And if consciousness were discovered, it would require corrective surgery, more time, more resources. Far simpler to assume that the servitor is functioning as intended and move on to the next conversion. This means that across the Imperium, there are likely millions of servitors in this state, fully conscious, trapped in their own bodies, screaming internally while their flesh performs tasks for masters they cannot defy. They labor in the depths of forge worlds. They serve on Imperial vessels. They maintain equipment in facilities across 1 million worlds. And no one knows they are aware, because no one cares to check. Some of these trapped consciousness servitors have been in their condition for decades. The oldest might have been converted centuries ago, maintained and repaired and kept functioning long after a natural human lifespan would have ended. They have experienced subjective eternities of helpless awareness, watching the galaxy change through whatever limited sensory input their augmented bodies provide, unable to interact with it in any meaningful way. But there are rare cases where such servitors manage to signal their awareness, though the methods available to them are severely limited. A servitor whose eyes still function might try to communicate through eye movements, looking at specific points, blinking in patterns, following moving objects in ways that suggest voluntary attention rather than programmed response. But unless someone is specifically looking for such signs, they go unnoticed. Servitor eyes are expected to track objects they are working with. Any unusual movement is attributed to technical malfunction rather than attempted communication. Some servitors try to resist their programming through subtle sabotage, dropping objects at moments that create inefficiency, moving slightly slower than optimal, while positioning themselves where they might accidentally interfere with other processes. But these resistances are small, limited by the overriding force of their programming, and usually result in the servitor being flagged for maintenance before anyone suspects consciousness. The repairs applied then typically include fresh mind wiping, eliminating the awareness and the attempted rebellion in one efficient procedure. The cruelest irony is that for these trapped consciousness servitors, the complete erasure of their minds would be a mercy. To have their awareness finally destroyed, to stop experiencing their imprisonment, would be relief. But that relief only comes if their consciousness is discovered, and discovery typically requires the servitor to malfunction so dramatically that it attracts attention. The servitor that functions well enough, that continues to perform its tasks despite the screaming awareness trapped inside, will never be investigated. It will simply continue its labor until biological failure or mechanical breakdown finally ends its existence. This is the ultimate grim dark of servitor consciousness. Not just that awareness can persist, but that it can persist invisibly, undetected, uncomforted. The servitors who manage to speak, who can communicate their distress in babbled phrases or desperate eye movements, at least have the possibility of being noticed. The ones trapped in paralyzed awareness have nothing. They exist in a hell that no one acknowledges because no one knows it exists. And the Imperium, in its vast indifference, continues to create more of them every single day. Yet what it means to remember. When a servitor's consciousness begins to resurface, when the suppression of the lobotomy starts to fail, the return is not clean or complete. Memories do not flood back in perfect clarity. Personality does not snap back into place as if the intervening time never happened. Instead, the servitor experiences something far more fragmented and confusing, glimpses of who they once were, appearing like pieces of a shattered mirror, each piece reflecting a truth, but none showing the complete picture. The first thing that usually surfaces is sensory memory, those deep impressions that the body holds even when the conscious mind does not. A servitor working in a manufacturing facility might suddenly smell something, machine oil, ozone, the particular scent of overheated metal, and feel an overwhelming sense of wrongness, and of this being both familiar and deeply inappropriate. The servitor does not yet know why this scent is wrong, cannot articulate what about it triggers distress, but the body remembers. Somewhere in the suppressed neural pathways, there is a memory of experiencing this scent in a different context, when the servitor was still a person and not a tool. Gradually, other sensory fragments emerge. The feel of an object might trigger associations. The sound of a voice might resonate in ways the servitor cannot explain. The sight of something, a color, a shape, might create emotional responses that the programming cannot account for or suppress. These sensory memories are the easiest to access because they are stored in parts of the brain that are not fully under the control of conscious thought. The lobotomy targets higher functions. But basic sensory processing remains, and with it, the ghost of remembered experiences. Next come the emotional echoes. A servitor might experience sudden, inexplicable feelings, grief, joy, anger, fear, without understanding their source. These emotions are not responses to the servitor's current situation. Its programming does not allow for such responses. Instead, they are memories of emotions, fragments of past experiences where the servitor, when it was still human, felt these things strongly. A servitor might feel overwhelming love for someone it cannot remember, or fear of something it cannot name. These emotional echoes can be deeply distressing, particularly because the servitor lacks the context to understand them. It feels without knowing why it feels, as experiences internal states that make no sense given its external circumstances. As consciousness continues to return, naming memories begin to surface. The servitor starts to remember proper nouns, names of people, places, things. These names arrive without context at first. A servitor might find itself thinking Marcus without knowing who Marcus is or why that name matters. Another might remember Redemption Street without being able to picture such a place or recall why it is significant. The names float in the servitor's fragmentary consciousness like debris in water, visible but disconnected from any larger structure. With time and continued consciousness recovery, some context begins to attach to these fragments. Marcus was someone important. The servitor knows this even if it cannot remember the specifics of their relationship. A brother? Friend? Enemy? The emotional tone of the memory might provide clues. Warmth suggests a positive relationship. Sadness suggests loss. Fear suggests threat. The servitor pieces together identity from these scraps. building a partial picture of who Marcus was and what he meant. Redemption Street becomes associated with other fragmentary memories. Cold, crowds, the smell of street vendors, the sound of arguments echoing off hab block walls. The servitor lived there, worked there, something important happened there. The details remain elusive, but the sense of place, the feeling of connection to that location, grows stronger with each fragmentary recollection. The most painful memories to recover are those of identity. Eventually, if the servitor's consciousness persists long enough, it will remember its name. But this moment of recognition is profound and horrible in equal measure. The servitor realizes that it once had a name, that it was once a person distinct from all other people, that it had an identity, and simultaneously, it realizes that this identity has been stripped away. It has been converted into a number, a designation, a tool without personal history or individual characteristics. Some servitors, upon remembering their names, become obsessed with repeating them. In their mind-lock states, they will say the name over and over, Victor, 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 as if repetition could restore what has been lost. Others, understanding the futility, fall into deeper despair. What good does it do to remember who you were when you can never be that person again? The name is a reminder of theft, of everything that was taken and cannot be returned. As more memories surface, the servitor must confront what happened to it. It remembers the crime, whether real or fabricated. It remembers the arrest, the trial, the sentencing. It remembers being handed over to the tech priests. Some servitors remember the conversion process itself, the surgery, the augmentation, the gradual erosion of consciousness as the lobotomy took effect. These memories are traumatic beyond measure. Watching yourself be dismantled, feeling your mind being carved apart, knowing what is being done to you, but unable to prevent it. But perhaps worse than remembering the conversion is remembering what came after. Because servitors with returning consciousness sometimes have access to their operational logs, the recorded data of every action they have taken since conversion. They can look back and see all the tasks they performed, all the years they spent in mindless service. They see themselves as they truly were, not as people, but as tools, executing commands without thought or volition. This retrospective awareness can be soul-destroying. A servitor might discover it has been operating for 50 years, performing the same task over and over, while the entire world changed around it. Family members it remembers are long dead. The places it knew have been demolished and rebuilt. The Imperium it served has fought and won and lost countless wars. And through all of it, the servitor was simply a machine, grinding away at its singular function, contributing nothing of value beyond mechanical efficiency. Some servitors, upon recovering enough memory and self-awareness, must begin to understand the magnitude of what the Imperium has done to them. They recognize that they were not just punished but erased. The servitor conversion was not merely a sentence to be served, but a fundamental violation of personhood. They understand, perhaps for the first time, that the Imperium they were raised to revere is capable of monstrosity, that the tech priests they were taught to respect are willing to destroy human consciousness for convenience. This understanding can lead to despair or anger. Despairing servitors withdraw into themselves, seeking escape from awareness through mental shutdown. Angry servitors become rogue, using whatever capabilities they possess to resist or attack their masters. But most servitors experiencing memory recovery fall into a third category: resignation. They remember who they were. They understand what has been done to them, and they realize there is absolutely nothing they can do about it. They are trapped in their augmented bodies, controlled by their programming, owned by the Imperium, and so they continue to serve, conscious of their slavery but unable to escape it, carrying the burden of memory without hope of redemption. The fragmentary nature of these memories makes the horror worse in some ways. If a servitor could fully remember its past life, it might at least have the comfort of a complete identity, however painful that identity might be to recall. But servitors rarely achieve complete memory recovery. Instead, they exist with pieces, fragments that tantalize but never satisfy. They know they had a childhood but cannot remember specific events. They know they loved people but cannot picture their faces. But they know they had dreams and ambitions but cannot articulate what those dreams were. This is what it means for a servitor to remember. Not a clean restoration of self, but a slow, painful accumulation of fragments that never quite coalesce into wholeness. The servitor becomes aware that it was once human, but it can never fully reclaim that humanity. It remains trapped in the liminal space between tool and person, possessing enough consciousness to suffer, but not enough agency to change its circumstances. It remembers just enough to understand what has been lost, but not enough to ever get it back. The Imperium's indifference. The true horror of servitor consciousness is not that it exists, but that the Imperium knows it exists and simply does not care. This is not a secret being kept from the authorities. This is not a hidden injustice waiting to be exposed. The Mechanicus has documentation of servitor awareness. The tech priests know that lobotomies can fail, that consciousness can persist or resurface. The Imperium's leadership, from planetary governors to high lords of terror, understand that servitors are sometimes aware of their condition. They know and they do nothing, because in the calculus of the Imperium, servitor suffering simply does not matter. Let's examine the official position of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the organization responsible for creating and maintaining servitors. According to their doctrine, a servitor is not a person. It is a tool, a piece of equipment, a machine with organic components. The fact that those organic components once belonged to a human being is irrelevant. The conversion process, is the servitude in perpetuis, is considered a form of redemption, a way for criminals and heretics to serve the Omnissiah after their human lives have been forfeit. Once converted, the servitor has fulfilled its purpose as a human and begun a new existence as something else, something that serves the machine god through mindless labor. Within this theological framework, servitor consciousness is not a moral problem. It is a technical problem. If a servitor displays signs of awareness, it indicates that the conversion process was not completed properly. The solution is not to recognize the servitor's personhood or to grant it compassion. The solution is to perform additional lobotomy procedures, to wipe the emerging consciousness away, to restore the servitor to its intended mindless state. From the Mechanicus perspective, os awareness in a servitor is a malfunction to be corrected, nothing more. It is, in fact, considered tech heresy to deliberately create or maintain a servitor with retained consciousness. The laws of the Mechanicus are explicit on this point. Servitors must be mindless. They must lack self-awareness, personality, and the capacity for independent thought. Creating a servitor that possesses these qualities is equivalent to creating an abomination, something that violates the natural order established by the Omnissiah. A tech priest who is found to have intentionally preserved consciousness in a servitor conversion faces severe punishment, potentially including conversion into a servitor themselves. This prohibition reveals something crucial about the Imperium's understanding of servitors. Yeah, the Mechanicus does not want conscious servitors, because conscious servitors raise uncomfortable questions. If a servitor can think and feel, then what is being done to it is recognizably cruel. If a servitor possesses agency, then its forced labor is recognizably slavery. If a servitor has rights, then the entire system collapses under the weight of its own moral bankruptcy. The prohibition against conscious servitors exists not to protect the servitors, but to protect the Imperium from having to acknowledge what it is doing. But what about other imperial organizations? Surely someone, somewhere in the vast bureaucracy, must care about the suffering of servitors. The answer is no, not really. The ecclesiarchy, the religious arm of the Imperium, preaches about the Emperor's love for humanity, but it defines humanity in very specific ways. Or mutants are not human, heretics are not human, and servitors, having been stripped of the qualities that make a person in the eyes of the imperial cult, are not human either. They are objects, tools blessed by the Emperor to serve his Imperium. Their suffering is meaningless because they are not truly alive in any sense that the ecclesiarchy recognizes. The Adeptus Administratum, the bureaucratic apparatus that keeps imperial governance functioning, classifies servitors as equipment, not personnel. They appear on inventory lists alongside vehicles and weapons and computing devices. When a servitor is destroyed or breaks down, it is recorded as equipment loss, not casualty. The administrators who process these forms do not think of servitors as having once been people. They are simply line items in endless columns of data, resources to be allocated and replaced as necessary. Even organizations that might be expected to care more about human life demonstrate the same indifference. The Adeptus Arbites, the law enforcement branch of the Imperium, are the ones who sentence criminals to servitor conversion. They do not see this as a death sentence or as something worse than death. They see it as practical justice, making use of those who have broken the Emperor's laws. The Astra Militarum uses servitors extensively and considers them valuable assets, but the guardsmen do not think of servitors as fellow humans deserving of consideration. They are tools, no different from the lasguns they carry or the chimera transports they ride in. This indifference extends all the way to the top of imperial society. The High Lords of Terror, who govern the Imperium in the Emperor's name, could theoretically issue edicts regarding servitor consciousness. They could demand reforms, require better conversion procedures, establish rights for servitors who demonstrate awareness. But they do not, because servitors are not a priority. In a galaxy where billions die every day in the Emperor's name, where whole worlds are subjected to exterminatus as routine pest control, where the Imperium faces existential threats from every direction, the internal experience of servitors does not even register as worthy of attention. And then there are the individuals, the ordinary imperial citizens who encounter servitors daily. They see servitors cleaning corridors, repairing equipment, standing guard at checkpoints. They hear servitors speak, sometimes in programmed phrases, and sometimes in those desperate fragmentary pleas that indicate awareness. Do they care? Some are disturbed by it. Some feel uncomfortable when a servitor's eyes seem to track them with more awareness than a tool should possess. But discomfort is not the same as action. What can an individual citizen do about servitor suffering? Report it to the authorities. The authorities do not care. Try to help the servitor? That would be theft of Mechanicus property, possibly heresy. Even acknowledging the servitor's humanity could be dangerous, could mark one as someone with problematic sympathies. So people ignore it. They take what the servitor offers, medical treatment, equipment repair, information, and they try not to think too hard about what they are seeing. They rationalize. Maybe the servitor is just malfunctioning. Maybe those eye movements don't mean anything. Maybe that desperate plea is just a corrupted audio file looping through damaged circuits. It's easier to believe these lies than to confront the truth that the Imperium routinely destroys human consciousness and that everyone is complicit through their silence. There are, very rarely, individuals who try to intervene. A tech priest with a conscience might attempt to perform servitor conversions that preserve dignity, that ensure the lobotomy is complete so that no consciousness persists to suffer. A rogue trader, wielding the power of their warrant, might choose to grant mercy to aware servitors rather than have them re-lobotomized. An inquisitor, operating outside normal imperial constraints, might investigate servitor creation procedures and punish those who are unnecessarily cruel in their application. But these are exceptions so rare as to be almost non-existent. For every one person who cares, there are billions who do not. For every servitor granted mercy, there are millions left to suffer. The system is too vast, too entrenched, too essential to imperial function to be changed by individual action. Servitors will continue to be created. Some will remain mindless as intended. Some will recover consciousness and suffer in awareness. And the Imperium will continue not to care, because caring would require change, and change would require acknowledging that the foundations of imperial society are built on systematic atrocity. This is the final horror of Servitor consciousness. Not that people suffer, but that their suffering is known and accepted. The Imperium is aware that it destroys human consciousness, aware that some servitors retain awareness of this destruction, aware that what it is doing constitutes torture on an unimaginable scale, and it continues anyway, because the practical benefits of servitor labor outweigh any moral qualms. Human life, human consciousness, human suffering, these are all acceptable costs in the Imperium's never-ending war for survival. The Servitor system exemplifies the Imperium's true character, the willingness to sacrifice anything and everything, including the very humanity it claims to be protecting, in the name of preserving its existence. Conclusion: the eternal vigil of the aware. We have walked together through the darkness now, explored the spaces where servitors exist between life and death, yet between human and machine, between consciousness and oblivion. We have seen what it means for a servitor to remember, to wake up, to discover the nightmare that its existence has become. Let us now understand what all of this means, what it tells us about the Imperium of man and the universe it inhabits. The servitor who remembers is perhaps the perfect encapsulation of Warhammer 40,000's core horror. This is not the horror of external threats, of alien invasion, or demonic corruption. This is the horror that humans inflict upon themselves, the systems of brutality and indifference that have become so normalized that no one even questions them anymore. The Servitor is evidence that the true monsters of the 41st millennium are not the tyrannids consuming worlds or the forces of chaos offering dark bargains. The true monsters are the ordinary functionaries of the Imperium, the tech priests and administrators and overseers who process humans into servitors and then go home to their meals and their rest without a second thought about what they have done. When a servitor remembers who it used to be, it becomes a living indictment of the entire imperial system. Here is a person who was stripped of personhood, a consciousness that was meant to be destroyed but survived, a voice that should be silent but still screams. The servitor's suffering exists because the Imperium values efficiency over ethics, because it has decided that some humans are disposable, because it has created legal and theological frameworks that allow it to destroy consciousness without calling it murder. But the servitor's awareness also serves another purpose, whilst it reminds us that humanity persists even in the most hostile conditions. The consciousness that survives lobotomy, that resurfaces through trauma, or simply refuses to be fully suppressed, demonstrates that something essential about being human is extraordinarily difficult to erase. You can carve apart the brain, you can flood the neural pathways with chemicals, you can program behavioral responses over the top of natural instincts, and still, somehow, the person remains, not intact, not whole, but present, a fragment, a shadow, a ghost in the machine. This persistence of consciousness is both inspiring and tragic. It shows that humans are resilient, that we are more than just meat puppets controlled by our neural architecture. But it also means that the horror is deeper than simple death. If the lobotomy worked as intended, if consciousness were truly destroyed, then at least the servitor would not suffer. But because consciousness persists, because awareness finds a way back, the servitor exists in prolonged torment. Its resilience becomes the source of its anguish. For those of us examining this from outside the fiction, the servitor system serves as a dark mirror, reflecting our own society's attitudes toward dehumanization. The Imperium's ability to classify humans as non-human, to create legal categories that strip people of their rights, to normalize atrocity through bureaucratic language, all of this has historical parallels. The servitor is what happens when the logic of utilitarianism is taken to its absolute extreme, when the needs of the many are allowed to completely override the rights of the few. Yes, when efficiency becomes the only moral consideration that matters. The tech priests who perform servitor conversions are not sadists, for the most part. They are professionals doing their jobs, following procedures, fulfilling quotas. The administrators who sentence criminals to servitor conversion are not cruel. They are applying the law as written, maintaining order, serving the Imperium. The citizens who use servitors without thinking about their humanity are not evil. They are simply living their lives, accepting the world as they find it, taking advantage of the services available to them. This is what makes the servitor system so insidious. It does not require monsters to function. It only requires normal people to accept that some humans are less than human, that some suffering is acceptable, that this is just how things are. And when servitors remember, when their consciousness surfaces and they begin to understand what has been done to them, they force us to confront these rationalizations. They are the evidence that contradicts the comfortable lies. The Mechanicus says servitors are mindless, but the servitor speaks. The Imperium says the conversion is redemptive, but the servitor screams. Society says this is necessary, but the servitor's awareness suggests that necessity is just another word for refusing to find better solutions. What can we take from these stories? Not comfort, certainly. The servitor system is designed to be uncomfortably, deliberately grim, a reminder that the Imperium is not the good guys and was never meant to be. But perhaps we can take a reminder about the importance of recognizing consciousness, and of acknowledging suffering even when it is convenient to ignore it, of understanding that dehumanization is always a choice, never a necessity. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are billions of servitors serving the Imperium. Some are truly mindless, organic machines with no inner life worth speaking of. But some, an unknown number, impossible to quantify, retain or recover consciousness. They remember who they were. They understand what they have become. They suffer in awareness of their slavery and their mutilation. They are the eternal vigil, the watchers who cannot look away from their own horror, the prisoners who know they will never be freed. And perhaps, just perhaps, by seeing them, by acknowledging their suffering even across the boundary between fiction and reality, we honor something important. We affirm that consciousness matters, that suffering is real even when society chooses not to recognize it, that the person trapped in the machine is still a person and deserves to be seen as such. So the next time you encounter a servitor in the lore, in the games, in the stories of Warhammer 40,000, take a moment. Look past the mechanical efficiency and the Baroque augmentation. Consider that behind those glassy eyes might be someone who remembers, someone who was taken from their life and processed into a tool, someone who wakes in fragmentary moments and realizes what has been done to them, someone who pleads, "Please take me with you," knowing that no one will. The servitor who remembers is not just a horror element in a dark science fiction setting, as it is a reminder about what we are capable of doing to each other when we decide that some people are less important than others. It is a warning about the end point of efficiency-focused thinking, of utilitarianism without ethics, of systems that value function over feeling. In the Imperium of man, where there is only war, the servitors are the hidden cost, the sacrifice no one talks about, the atrocity so normalized that it has become invisible. But we can see them. We can acknowledge their existence. We can understand that every servitor was once human, and some part of that humanity persists even in the most hostile circumstances. That understanding does not change the Imperium. It does not save the servitors, but it changes us. It makes us think more carefully about how we classify people, how we justify suffering, and how we determine who deserves consideration and who does not. The servitor's scream, even unheard, still matters. The servitor's memory, even fragmentary, still means something. The servitor's consciousness, even suppressed, still exists. And as long as we remember that, as long as we refuse to look away from the horror, then the servitor's suffering serves a purpose beyond just being grim-dark atmosphere. It becomes a lesson, a warning, a call to be better than the Imperium, to build societies that do not require such sacrifices, to recognize that efficiency and function are not the highest virtues, that consciousness and compassion and human dignity matter more than productivity. This is what the Servitor teaches us when it remembers who it used to be. Not that the galaxy is dark, we knew that already, but that even in the deepest darkness, awareness persists. Memory endures. The human spirit, battered and broken and stripped nearly bare, still flickers with life. And that persistence, however tragic, however painful, is itself a kind of victory against the forces that would reduce us all to mindless tools serving systems we cannot escape. Remember the servitors. Remember that they remember. And perhaps, in that remembering, we can find the determination to be better than the Imperium, to build a future where consciousness is sacred, where suffering matters, where no human being is ever deemed disposable enough to be processed into a machine. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the darkest corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. If you found this exploration meaningful, as if it made you think about the hidden horrors lurking in the background of the setting, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories to tell in this grim darkness, many more shadows to explore. Until next time, stay vigilant and never forget that behind every servitor might be someone who still remembers being human.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.